Well, on migration, the government actually in the past 2 years has passed a lot of laws, or I mean, they make laws and then the parliament has passed them to be more restrictive. It's actually more about making sure that these laws also work, making sure that we have enough police to actually enforce them. So I'm not sure I see that huge gap on this one. On tax cuts, I think it's a question of, is this actually feasible? The Conservatives are creating a 90 to 100 billion gap in budgets with their proposed tax cuts, depending on which estimate you take. And the question is, how do you finance that? Even with a reform of the debt brake, that's not going to be feasible. We also have European fiscal rules, which are actually going to be pretty restrictive. So that will be the really difficult conversation to have.
Philippa, I hear you saying the European fiscal rules are restrictive, but let's face it, apart from Germany, pretty much everyone, well, not everyone, but a lot of countries break those fiscal rules and get away with it as well. As you know better than I do, reform of stability and growth has got to be part of the wider recipe for Europe's recovery, hasn't it?
If you ask me, yes, absolutely. I mean, the problem is we had a reform of the European fiscal rules in the past year. I was not a fan of how this reform was done. I was advocating for something else. Just briefly to tell you the main outcome, we're now focusing very much on debt to GDP, which I think is a meaningless number, and it's not really feasible to pin down your balance sheet at a certain size if you want to decarbonize and if you want to ramp up defense. So that just doesn't work. But that's where the reform came down to. And I think it's going to be hard to just ignore those, especially when we're going against specific parts of the rules that Germany pushed through really hard. I mean, I really hope that we can. I think it's not good for the country. I don't think it's good for Europe. I think we're going to be faced with huge challenges from the Trump administration. So I really think that we should focus on something else. We should focus on bringing growth back and keeping the country and Europe together. But it's not going to be an easy one, and broad tax cuts are going to be a really, really tough one in that situation. I think you need to focus your budgetary ammunition that you have. You need to focus that a little bit more.
Philippa, let me accelerate and let's say you're successful in your bid for Munich North going forward, and the SPD is a major part of the government going forward. How would you now deal with the fact that, for instance, we have steel tariffs? We have ThyssenKrupp shares called down, I understand, around about 9% in pre-market as well. What does Europe need to do? Does it need to be more robust, or does it need to find a way to work with Donald Trump without facing him down? How would you deal with this current crisis?
Yeah, that's the really big question. I think we need to do a couple of things. So first of all, I think Germany needs to work to become less export dependent. That is now an obvious vulnerability in that world order. So we need to make sure that domestic demand is a little bit higher. Then I think we need to work on European growth because that's actually, I mean, our biggest export market is in Europe. So if we have growth here, it works out. And then I think we need to develop service sector and high-tech service sectors more, like Sweden did. They have had a very industrial economy as well, and then they've been shifting to high-tech and software and database services, and I think that makes them a little bit less vulnerable, and that makes also their industrial companies more productive and less exposed to be hit in kind of one area.